The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
So I've been getting sort of two questions that are kind of related, but they're also separate questions about Democrats and the future. And this is a good opportunity to kind of talk about both. And the two questions have been, what should the Democratic platform be? And what should the Democratic agenda be? And they might sound like they're the same thing, but they're not. Because when I hear what should the Democratic agenda be, that means for me, once Democrats take over the House from 2019 to 2021, right? That 2-year period, what should the priorities be of Democrats in the House? Democratic platform means what should be the campaign platform for 2020. There's a lot of overlap between those two things, but they're not actually the same thing. So listen, breaking news, I'm a pragmatist and I want to win. And when I think about something like a platform or an agenda, I think not only about what I like, it's not just creating a list of things that would be a progressive paradise, but that's not totally realistic in a vacuum. So I also think about what would work politically. We need to find balance. And there's a lot of people in the audience who don't like that about me, who say, oh, pragmatic David Pakman is ignoring the fact that XYZ is simply not progressive. Well, yeah, I think we've got to find balance. So between idealism and pragmatism, you need some combination of aspirational big ideas, but also things you can do so you can actually chalk up some accomplishments and justify getting elected again, getting reelected. There's a balance between policy that will appeal to the base and bringing in people from the right and middle to vote for you. You've got to understand what issues are voting issues. So where I immediately start is, number one, infrastructure. No brainer. We need to fix things. Even Trump wanted infrastructure. He wanted to do it in a total crony capitalist handout, corrupt way. But it's going to tie up Republicans if all of a sudden now they're against infrastructure. They'll come up with some way to explain why the way Trump wanted to do it is good and the way Democrats want to do it is bad. But make them play that game. So infrastructure has to be there. It also provides jobs. We have to fix bridges and airports and our electrical grid. They're a total joke. It'll help the construction industry and its demand side stimulus. Number two, there should be a fiduciary rule created that makes the relationship between clients and their financial advisors more like that with lawyers, period. Okay, there will be arguments against this, but this should be done. And it's a sort of backdoor to solve lots of current issues in the financial world without doing like a financial transaction tax, which we should have, by the way, but it's just a more complicated thing to do. That's something that should definitely be done, and it should be part of the Democratic agenda between now and 2021. What about the minimum wage? I think the answer is obviously yes, but this is controversial. And you will see people on the right who say, oh, well, what if they straw man us with why don't we make the minimum wage $100 an hour or $500 an hour? It's just more money for everybody, right? No one who is serious about the minimum wage is suggesting that. We're talking about a modest increase to the minimum wage. It's good for employees. It's good for the economy. Right now, the federal minimum wage is still $7.25 an hour. It's a joke, okay? This is about $14,500 full-time per year for a 50-week work year. Set up 50 to 75% incremental increases, and let's start boosting it. No one can argue that that's crazy, and you're going to start moving in the direction we ultimately want to go. Fighting climate change in a serious manner. There is no economic or moral argument against this, period. If cities go underwater, it's terrible for everybody. If people die from heat waves, it's bad for everybody. Infrastructure connects to this because much of replacing old buildings with efficient new ones and replacing old electrical with new electrical, it's good for climate change and it's good for the economy. And then we get to healthcare. where the big question among some on the left is, do Democrats make single payer part of the platform or not? The answer for me is very simple. Yes, do it. Stop being afraid. Every other country in the developed world does it. Don't be afraid. It's not a government takeover of healthcare. It's a government takeover of health insurance, which is a terrible industry. You don't hate your doctor. You hate how the relationship with your doctor has been perverted by for-profit insurance companies. Start from that as a negotiating point and negotiate from there, because you probably, in the next 2 years, you're going to have to negotiate. Net neutrality, no question. You've got to at least propose something specific on campaign finance reform. I understand a lot of Democrats in power don't want to change the system, just like Republicans don't want to change the system, because this is the system that brought them to power in the first place. But let's do something, whether it's on PAC money or public financing of elections, figure something out. And then voter suppression. Call it the full vote initiative. I don't know. I'm just thinking, call it the full vote initiative. This would include fixing the Voting Rights Act, which was gutted, dealing with voter suppression tactics. The details would need to be figured out, but the full vote initiative must be part of the Democratic agenda. And then lastly, what about guns? The issue with guns is that it may not be a voting issue. It may alienate voters. So I want, at minimum, as I punch my microphone, and I apologize, we need full background checks for all transactions, and we need gun insurance like a car. We need to think about the pragmatism, though. Does that alienate people? Bill Scher has talked to us about the impact of gun safety regulations in influencing voters. Those are on the list for me, certainly for the Democratic agenda. And in addition to that, for the Democratic platform going forward. What's missing? Where am I wrong? Let me know. I'm on Twitter at @dpacman.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Welcome back to the show. Let me say a quick thank you to William Harris, who's today's new member of the day. Also, thanks to Elaine Oma, who has been with us as a member for 5 years. 5 years makes Elaine today's sustaining longtime member of the day. Join William and Elaine at www.joinpakman.com. Okay, we are going to go to the phones early this week, what with the Thanksgiving holiday here in the United States. A lot of people want to be heard from. 617-830-4750 is the number. Let's start with our caller from the 469 area code. Caller from 469. Who's this? What's on your mind?
Hi, this is Louis from Dallas, Texas.
All right, and we're not on speakerphone or Bluetooth, are we? Because we're getting a very strange noise.
No, we're not.
All right, go ahead, Lou.
Where am I? So I was wondering, would you ever run for office in any point in your life? Also, how's Pat doing? I want to know how Pat is doing today.
Pat's doing great. He's working on today's show, and I might run for office in the very far future. I don't see doing that anytime soon. I could never be president, of course, because I was not born in the United States. That's a limitation I'm just going to have to deal with. But it wouldn't be, I don't have any particular interest in running for office because it seems like it's just very hard to get things done as a cog in the wheel. Whereas I have total control on the show and an audience that in and of themselves can do a lot of activism that I can speak to. So I don't know. I've never ruled out running for office at some point, maybe, but it would have to really be the perfect opportunity. It's not like I'm dying to be an elected official.
Mm-hmm. That's good. That's good. I like what you do now. So that's all I want to ask. Thank you.
All right. Very good, Louis. Thank you. Appreciate the call. 617-830-4750 is the number. Let's go to our next caller from the 951 area code. Caller from 951, go ahead.
Hi, David.
How are you?
Good. Hey, I moved down to California, and and just got close to the California wildfires. And I was hoping to just talk a little bit about how we've been relaxing the building standards so much in this country that it's becoming just dangerous to even hardly live on an upper floor of a building with the sprinkler systems the way they've reduced and that kind of thing. And I ended up coming down to California to promote alternative building materials that are fireproof, and I thought that might be interesting for some of the listeners.
And that's your job, promoting construction using less flammable building materials?
Well, that's the business I'm trying to currently pursue. So, but we need to look at building with way more concrete and steel and things that don't burn, especially in California here.
Steel's tough when Trump's slamming tariffs on it, you know? Yeah,
that is very tough. That when it's being attacked basically by Trump, and but with the wildfires here, I don't think there's any choice that we have to, rebuild with non-flammable building materials, not just put something that's.
How do you make money with such a business? In other words, so you're trying to get that business going, but will you sell the materials? Are you looking to do construction? Like, I'm trying to understand. Are you looking to be a consultant?
Well, I'm planning to build a block factory out in the desert to build non-flammable building blocks called aircrete. So that's the ultimate goal. And I moved down from Alaska to do it. So just trying to get things going, just things just keep burning down here. So it's just like to raise awareness as much as I can about, there is alternatives out there that aren't flammable that we can build these buildings out of and never have to have another paradise that happens where the entire town gets wiped out.
All right, very important message, and I appreciate you making it. I'm going to let you go. It does sound like you're very busy there and up to a lot of stuff, so I'll let you get back to that. Let's go to our caller from the 647 area code. Caller from 647, who's this? Where are you calling from? What's on your mind?
Hi, is this me?
Yes, we've got you turned up as loud as you'll go, and I can still barely hear you. So what might we be able to do?
Is that better?
That is better, yes.
Okay, so I'm actually calling from Canada, and I sort of have a bit more of like an international sort of story.
Okay.
That I want to talk about.
Sure.
So I read this blog post on MTL Blog, so it's like a Montreal-based publication. It's an English publication in Montreal. And it said something, the title was, Justin Trudeau is unfortunately the world's last hope, which actually made me want to laugh because, well, Justin Trudeau, well, he's not very insanely popular in Canada. But then when I thought about it, you see the rise of like nationalism around the world with first like Donald Trump, and then like things like Theresa May in the UK being laughed out of like Brexit negotiations. And in France, you got protests on the streets and for like higher fuel prices. Angela Merkel in Germany not running for re-election, the rise of, was it Bolsonaro in Brazil?
Right.
And here in Canada, you've literally got this sort of consistency in Canadian politics that like pseudo-progressive, mild-mannered, like meek Justin Trudeau, who's like generally inoffensive. Canadian politics have been insanely predictable relative to the rest of the world. I mean, we got this rise of this guy named Maxime Bernier, who's like, honestly, I'd say he's like a moderate Republican at worst. So I want to know what your opinion is on this.
On what exactly?
On like, why do you think that, I don't know, I guess I'm trying to say is like, if Justin Trudeau really is the world's last hope, I'd say the world is pretty doomed. But I guess what I'm trying to say is like, there's this general rise of nationalism and like people are like, a lot of these, like, for example, like Emmanuel Macron and Angela Merkel are generally perceived like more positively in like the international community as while their domestic support is falling. And I think that's very interesting because it shows something about like Donald Trump as well. Like I find it weird that his approval rating sits at around like 38-39%, I believe. Like that's what I saw most recently. And like, I don't know, I find that very interesting.
Okay, did you have any questions for me today?
Yeah, I want to know what your opinion is on how exactly the world is going to pull back from something like this. Like, I know it's a very like vague sort of question.
Pull back from what though?
This rise of like right-wing nationalism.
Oh yes, well that we've been talking about that extensively. I didn't necessarily see exactly how that was the sort of question or focus there of the lead up, but there needs to be a drastic change. A lot of it does have to do with the U.S. I mean, for better or worse, the U.S. is a taste maker when it comes to a lot of the West. And when you've got the president of the United States signaling white nationalists and white supremacists and anti-Semites and the anti-immigration crowd, the xenophobes, that he's their guy and he's going to do what they want, that is only going to foment those parties from gaining more power in Poland and Hungary and so many other places. So that's a problem we've got to deal with. Thank you so much for the call. Really appreciate it. 617-830-4750 is the number. Let's go next to our caller from the 315 area code. Caller from 315, go ahead.
Hello, this is Jay from upstate New York.
Hey, Jay, what's going on?
I just wanted to get your input on the turnout for the youth vote for the midterms this year. How do you feel about the percentage? I believe it's roughly 30% of the youth vote turned out to vote.
Well, listen, it's pathetic.
I can't seem to express my frustration without expletives, so I wanted to get a more articulate view from you.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so historically, we know that older voters tend to vote more until they get so old that it's like hard to vote, but then absentee ballots help that. But basically we know that younger voters are not voting in the same proportions as older voters, middle-aged, older voters, adults, whatever. Young adults vote the least. In midterms, the turnout is particularly low in general and also among young voters. If only, there's this catch-22 where it's not even a catch-22, it's more of a vicious circle. Young voters often don't participate because they don't understand how their participation will influence the system in ways that will change circumstances for them. They're like, my vote doesn't matter, it won't do anything. Well, if young voters voted at 60% instead of 30%, which that's still 40% of them not voting, right? If they could just have 60% of young voters voting, all of a sudden you would immediately matter because you're deciding elections, but they're choosing not to do that. And it's this depressing, disappointing, vicious circle. So yeah, I'm always disappointed by the pathetically low voter turnout. Young people especially should be voting because they actually have a chance of steering the ship now before they end up taking over control of a society that they played no role in directing to begin with. Because ultimately young people are going to be in charge, and wouldn't they prefer to be in charge of a system they helped shape? They're not doing that by not voting, and it's embarrassing.
If I could have one quick follow-up, what do we do to motivate them that we're not already doing?
From the young voters I talk to, they don't see how voting will make a difference. They often have this approach of, which is not unique to them, but it does seem to exist a lot in young voters of, listen, no matter who I vote for, more or less, it's like I'm still going to come out of college with huge debt if they're still in college, or I'm still going to have my huge college debt. I'm still going to be working a job that doesn't really pay a good wage. They just don't understand how their votes impact their future. And I think the younger people are, the easier it is to ignore activities that don't have an immediate gain or an immediate impact. So I think we need to be better at communicating how, number one, their vote does matter, and number two, how it matters in ways that even if they don't immediately see changes or results, very soon there will be changes. Like if we got truly progressive representation in the House, Senate, and White House, within 8 years, you would see pretty significant change in a lot of areas. Healthcare could change dramatically. Education could. 8 years isn't that crazy for an 18-year-old to think about. I hope, anyway.
As opposed to a 92-year-old.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for the call. Really appreciate
very
it.
much.
Very important issue. Young people, man, you got to vote. Let's go next to the 916 area code. Caller from 916. Who's this? Where are you calling from?
Hey, David. This is Tony. I'm calling from California. I just kind of wanted to talk about what you think about the market and this giant drop that we had today, and whether it's an indication of a more severe drop like we had back in, 2007, 2008?
Yep.
Or if this is just more of a more minor correction.
Nobody knows. I mean, listen, here's the thing. To the extent that there have always been downturns historically, we knew that the longer the run-up in the stock market went, the closer we were to a correction. But like, I'm literally not saying anything unique there other than as time passes, you are closer to the next correction whenever it is. That's a very unremarkable statement. Over the last couple of years, it has become increasingly apparent that stock market valuations have been significantly getting ahead of the value of a lot of these companies based on earnings and based on assets. So that is what we might call froth in the stock markets, or to quote Alan Greenspan, irrational exuberance. I don't know, call it whatever you want. So we've basically now lost all of the gains of 2018, and most of the markets are now just slightly down from where they started 2018. So 2018 now is gone. There's been no gains in 2018. Of course, dividends can sort of outdo that. If you're earning 2-3% dividends, then that's basically what you've earned in 2018 because stock prices are basically even. The next question is what you were asking, which is this the bottom of now starting to recover? Or is this just the beginning of a larger correction, which could be 15%, it could be 20%? I have no idea. Anyone who pretends to know is just guessing. All I can tell you is my personal story, which is when I log in and look at my mutual fund account, it's really depressing the last couple of months. And I look at it and I'm just kind of like, where'd the money go? This doesn't seem good. And I couldn't tell you what it is that's going to happen next.
I guess my next question is, last year, probably around July, my family, we were looking to buy a house, but the prices of houses here in California especially, but particularly in this market, are so incredibly high and it was so competitive as well that we were getting outbid. Like, we would go in at $375,000 on a house, and someone from the Bay Area would come in at $415,000. And there's just no way, unless we completely settle on a house. So we decided to not buy a house at all. When do you think it would be a smart time to even make that kind of a leap or a jump into a house?
Well, listen, I am going to tell you, I am not going to give you financial advice because that's not what I do on the program. But here's what I will say about housing markets. There are starting to be signs of significant slowdown nationally in the housing market. And thus, if over the next 2 to 4 years, prices decline, those could be moments to get in. But here's the thing about real estate. Real estate markets are very compartmentalized. So you will likely see that the hot markets like New York, knock on wood, Boston remains one for my sake, and some of those others. Some of those hot markets that are places people are continuing to move to and that money is coming into, even if nationally home prices decline, you may not see significant declines or any declines in those hot markets because the markets are very compartmentalized. So the answer is you're just going to have to wait and see if and when there is a price level that works for you.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks so much. Really appreciate the call. Shortened calls because of the Thanksgiving holiday, so I am out of time. Apologies to the 32 people. I really do apologize. 32 people who are holding, but I am out of time. More calls next week, I promise.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
So for this week's classic interview, we're dealing with an important issue, but it's also Thanksgiving, and we've been hearing from Pat about vegan Thanksgiving and vegan shepherd's pie with lentils, and people are demanding the recipe from him on our subreddit. So we're going to go back to when I interviewed Brian Manowitz, who is known as the vegan black metal chef. He's both a extraordinarily heavy metal musician, whom former producer Lewis was a big fan of, and also a vegan chef. So this is a shout out to, it's not really a shout out to anybody actually, but it sort of relates to Thanksgiving, and we're having a good time, and Thanksgiving is tomorrow or yesterday or the day before, depending on when you're watching this. But let's get right to it. My interview from February of 2016 with Brian Manowitz, vegan black metal chef. I'm joined today by Brian Manowitz, known to those who know him as the vegan black metal chef. Brian, let's start with the sort of simplest question first. How long have you been vegan and why?
Well, greetings, listeners of the David Pakman Show and watchers. I've been vegan for about 15 or so years, and the fast answer I tell people is I don't believe in the exploitation of animals.
And talk about what that means to you in terms of veganism, vegetarianism, etc. Is there any scenario in which animal products are consumed that wouldn't be exploitation to you, or is any consumption of animal products whatsoever exploitative in your mind?
Well, I believe as we were talking earlier, quite some time ago, I believe you had mentioned something like if someone was, if it was some native tribe somewhere that was living just off the land, and something like that, would that be considered exploitation of animals? And to that, I say no. If it was some any of the very few still existing native tribes that just live off the land, I'm not talking to them. Quite honestly, I'm just talking to the citied world that, and especially sort of the first world, of which I'm not sure if the U.S. is a part of anymore or not, but mostly the citied world. And even sort of rural city world, but yeah, but the people in what we would consider relatively normal circumstances.
So it sounds like, if I understand correctly, part of whether animal consumption, either of animal meat or animal products, whether it's exploitative in your mind, depends on sort of the life situation of those who might be consuming the animals in terms of the alternatives they have. Am I understanding that?
Yeah, in one sense, yes. I mean, you can only take the ivory tower so far, in the sense that that at some point, really the basics of veganism is these animals that we consume and that we use are living their life in utter hell, basically for our benefit, which is not needed. And so that's really the bottom line of everything, is we want to cut out that whole these animals living in utter hell, and the best part of their life is their death. So there might be some fringe circumstances about this or that, but it's really not important in the big scheme of things.
I'm curious, though, if you hold that or believe that, taking an animal that didn't necessarily choose to be born, it also certainly didn't choose to be used for food or for its products to be taken by humans for consumption. And you say, well, in the city, it's exploitative to do this to the animal, but in a rural place, it isn't. It might be hard for some people to sort of understand, if you believe that morally, if the animal doesn't have a say in the matter, it's exploitation. Why is it not exploitation merely because humans might be living in an area where they have fewer alternatives? I'm trying to understand the sort of consistency of that.
Absolutely, absolutely. And when I say rural, I don't honestly mean like rural America.
No, I get it.
Yeah, it's still quite... I'm talking about if you're some kind of native tribe, if you're an Eskimo, there's zero vegetation around, then and that's what you live off the land, then yeah, if that's what you absolutely have to do to survive, then yeah, I don't have a problem with it, because ultimately there's sort of two sides of it. There's sort of the moral side, which which is sort of what I'm talking about here. And then there's also the ultimate, the relative sense in that moral actions have consequences, and the ultimate sense in that there essentially are no morals. So in the ultimate sense, that's what I'm talking about with these native tribes, is that there really is no moral aspect here. They're doing what they need to do to survive, just like the rest of nature. They're living in nature.
I'm curious though, because if you go back before the agricultural revolution, for example, where humans said, hey, you know what, instead of sort of being nomadic and having a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, we're going to settle down here and grow and depend on wheat or whatever it is. Prior to that, when humans were nomadic and sort of hunter-gatherers, their meat consumption in many cases was mostly the leftover animals that some larger, stronger predator had killed. And otherwise, they were mostly eating berries and what could be found naturally, right? Plants, vegetables, etc. So is it even a good argument to say that you make exceptions now for those who are in these native areas when even when we go back pre-agricultural revolution, excuse me, we still had a lot of humans that were able to get by without certainly killing meat, if not eating it at all. Doesn't it sound a little bit strange to make the argument out of necessity now when we have examples of non-meat eaters from so long ago?
Well, here's the thing. It doesn't even cross my mind because it doesn't even matter. Like, we're talking about so few people and such a nothing in the grand scheme of things that it's totally off the point. It literally doesn't matter. In terms of all the other benefits of veganism to the planet, to society, and everything else, those fringe cases don't matter.
They don't matter to you anyway.
Yeah, they don't matter to me.
Yeah, okay. Fair enough.
It's complete that completely misses the point of the greater aspect of it.
Okay, a couple other things I want to touch on with you. Number one, you talked about the sort of environmental benefit of veganism. In my research, it seems the real environmental benefit is in the reduction of meat consumption, particularly red meat and a few other specific types of meat. Do you agree that in terms of health, there's no evidence that veganism versus, for example, the Mediterranean diet, which limits meat consumption, is healthier? In all the research I've done, there's no truly extensive, all-encompassing study that says that a vegan diet is healthier.
Yeah, well, for one, I've not done extensive research on. I've not read every study on PubMed about health benefits or not health benefits with the vegan diet. Quite honestly, I don't think that many studies have been done on the vegan diet, especially very large scale studies like things with like the Mediterranean diet. In terms of what's the greatest benefit for the planet, was that what you said before?
Yeah, well, no, I was just sort of seeing if we were on the same page, that there's no doubt that reducing meat consumption is good environmentally, but that in terms of human health, there's no evidence that says veganism is the healthiest diet.
Well, healthiest is kind of, well, like to me, health is kind of a continuum. It's not this is healthy versus this is unhealthy.
Right.
It's more like is healthier than this, is healthier than that. I mean, I guess you could probably say that a raw fruit or vegetable might be considered maybe the healthiest thing. But again, that's still a little bit arbitrary because there's different circumstances.
Sure.
But even regardless, though, quite honestly, I don't cite studies in my thing, in any of my things that I write or things that I talk about, even though I have a science background. I studied behavioral neuroscience in school.
Yeah.
And worked in a research lab, and we discuss papers around the lab table all the time. And I'm peer-reviewed journals and everything. And I think science is great. I think science has an absolute place. However, I don't talk about it in the grand scheme of things because, for one, anything that requires a statistical analysis to show whether something is more probable or less probable, or essentially whether they're saying this is correct or this is not correct, quite honestly has a tendency to go back and forth throughout the ages.
Sure.
So I'm not even going to go there. What I'm going to go for is what is obvious and what can be shown with no statistical studies whatsoever. It's obvious that animals require much more food that you put into them than you get out of them.
Right.
That's just obvious. That doesn't require a paper, doesn't require a study. You have to feed animals, and especially in our case with factory farms, corn and soybeans and even alfalfa, that requires tremendous amount more resources going into it, be it the actual food that we could be feeding people, be it water that is used for the agriculture and for all the steps involved, the fuel for all the transportation steps involved. There's a whole lot of waste in all these intermediary steps. And that doesn't require any kind of paper or study. That's just obvious. You can see that there is waste and you're getting far less out than what you're putting in.
How far should this be taken with regard to even vegetables, right? I mean, there are vegetables like avocado, which also require disproportionately more water for the nutrients that you get out compared to other particular vegetables. I mean, should the environmental argument even be applied within vegetables? Like, should we get rid of or go away from the vegetables that require more water per nutrient density?
Well, here's the thing. If you got rid of the meat in general, the water wouldn't even be a question because there'd just be enough water.
Fair enough. Okay, let me ask you something about a trend now in veganism that I've been reading about. This is the bivalve veganism, which is the idea that bivalves, right, clams, mussels, mollusks, scallops, etc., they're certainly animals to some extent, but the idea that they're not sentient in any way. And thus, I've increasingly been reading about vegans who say, I'm vegan, but I eat specifically bivalves. I don't eat fish, I don't eat octopus, but bivalves I feel morally okay eating in the same way that a vegetable is alive, but it is not sentient. Where are you on the bivalve debate?
Yeah, so actually I'd only first heard of this, I guess about a year or so ago.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't even know this was a thing until then. Here's where I'm at. First of all, this is mostly for people that live in the ivory tower. Like again, this is this philosophy. If we just get rid of animal exploitation at the root, then this is not even a question. Well, first of all, bivalves and mollusks and things, they have nerve ganglion. Whether or not you consider those formal brains, I mean, our bodies have nerve ganglion that do lots of subconscious computations for our brain, and they're basically like mini brains. So
you reject the idea that bivalves aren't sentient in some sense.
I think it's even ridiculous to talk about, and
wow.
And yeah, like if I can't believe people are focusing on that as opposed to just getting rid of the exploitation of animals in general.
Well, I guess the question is, are you exploiting a mussel if you determine that it may be no more sentient than a plant, right? If you believe that, then are you really exploiting it?
Yeah, I mean, again, this is where if you focus on fringe cases, the ivory tower breaks down. Like the pure theory, if you want to just go by pure theory of it, then who knows? Quite honestly, pain is an internal phenomenon anyways. You can't really know whether anything experiences pain.
Well, yeah, kind of. But I mean, I think that's a sort of dangerous path to go down, because science does know a lot about pain, right? I mean, I think it would be, I don't know that it's a good argument to say we can't even really know, because then maybe plants feel pain and we shouldn't be exploiting plants.
Well, no, exactly. I mean, but what I'm saying is if you take that argument of well, I don't think it's any more sentient. Why not? I mean, it has nerves. It has nerve ganglion. Why is it like sentience? Of course, is a degree, and again, it's like if we just cut out animal exploitation at the root, that's the core of veganism.
Yeah.
Not weird fringe things.
Hey, do you eat honey?
I do not.
You do not eat honey. All right. Well, do you believe the bees are exploited if we empty the honeycomb?
I do. I think we should leave honey for the bees and leave them well enough alone.
All right. Brian Manowitz, the most hardcore vegan we've ever had on the show, that's for sure. Known to many as the vegan black metal chef. Check him out on YouTube. Google him. Brian, thanks for talking to us.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your time.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Okay, welcome back to the show. Let's get into audience questions for the week. We're doing these a little early because of the Thanksgiving holiday. If you haven't noticed, it's sort of like a Friday show today, even though it's Wednesday, even though you might still be watching this or listening to it on Friday, I guess, because of the holiday or something. In any case, let's get right into audience questions. Hey, David, if Donald Trump is this insane and erratic with a re-election campaign looming in less than 2 years, how insane and erratic will he get once he realizes he doesn't have to run for re-election? Okay, so the premise, as I understand it, is if Trump wins in 2020 and then he has 4 years and he knows he has no more re-election, isn't he going to get even more unhinged and erratic? I actually don't think that he will on policy, but he might when it comes to all of the sidebar repression of media and ignoring the Constitution and that type of thing. And I'll explain to you what I mean. The reality is that Trump has never really had hard and fast political positions. It's always been kind of gauging the room. And even from the beginning of his presidential campaign, which I believe started with him not really even wanting to or planning to be president of the United States, more sort of thinking about it as a publicity thing. If he can come in respectably second or third in the Republican primary, this would be great for his reality shows. This would be great for the Trump brand or whatever. So he would sort of feel around about trade. We're getting killed on trade and China's beating us. And then he would get a reaction from the audience and he would say, let me do more of that because that sort of went well. But does he really have sincerely held positions and particularly sincerely held Republican positions on trade? Not really. He doesn't even know about it, is what we figured out. He doesn't know the basics of economics or currency or trade or any of it. He's just going to what he gets a positive reaction for doing in front of people. Muslim ban is another example. Insulting people, coming up with pet names for them, and hearing from right-wingers about how he really dominated, he really showed those other people. It's just what he does if he feels that it's working for him. So could he get more erratic if he wins and then has 4 years knowing he doesn't have to run for anything at the end? Yes, but it's not going to be on policy because that's always just been what the crowd wants. Trump doesn't really seem to have his strongest convictions from what we learn about behind the scenes are about things like he really believes 3 to 5 million people voted illegally for Hillary Clinton. That we know behind the scenes he continued to talk about, even when in the public narrative, it was pretty clear that it was bogus and it was kind of going away. And his voter fraud commission had already been disbanded. If the polls say that he's not doing well, he wouldn't even necessarily adjust what he's doing on that basis because he has always said the polls are wrong. Does he believe the polls are wrong? I don't know, but that's the story that he's been telling. So it's going to be very interesting to see, but I don't expect that when it comes to policy, a Trump that has won re-election knows he doesn't ever have to justify anything on the basis of getting reelected again. I don't think that makes him more erratic as far as that goes. However, where he will absolutely be even more erratic and unhinged is where what you can probably guess. The more Trump believes that he could be in trouble, we see him go nuts publicly. Every time we, after the fact, find out, oh, a judge decided this about the Mueller investigation, or he learned that this person was set to be indicted. That correlates to lashing out on Twitter and doing all sorts of wacky stuff and increasing his attempts to obstruct Trump Russia. So I think that that's what really has the possibility of pushing Trump over the edge. His biggest hindrance is extreme narcissism, and that's what would be most interesting to see him deal with in a second term, which of course I hope he doesn't get, and we need to be working to ensure that Donald Trump doesn't get. If you disagree with me, if you think Trump on policy will get more erratic if he wins re-election, let me know. I want to hear from you. Hey, David, Nancy Pelosi says that gun control will be a priority for the new Democratic House in 2019. Is this a good idea? Is the political risk worth the possibility of actually accomplishing anything? Excellent question. Okay. Earlier this week, we talked about what should the Democratic agenda be for the incoming Congress? And parallel to that, it's not the same, but it's parallel. What should the Democratic platform be for 2020? This question is about the agenda. What should, and this is presuming, I believe, that Nancy Pelosi becomes Speaker of the House for the Democrats, what should the agenda be of the Democrats once they are sworn back in and take over control? We've talked about the issue of gun rights before many times. Is voting, is it a voting issue when politicians talk about gun rights? I think that it only is when the position is seen as very extreme. Doesn't mean that it's actually a very extreme position. But as Bill Scher has told us, and as others have told us, voting rights does not really seem to translate into getting people to vote one way or the other, assuming once again that what they are portrayed as supporting or being against, that their position is not being portrayed as absolutely and totally outrageous. And as we talked about this week, Democrats need to understand that at a certain point, I know that there's sort of a sliding scale of idealism and pragmatism. I am often criticized by some on the left for being too much on the pragmatism side. I have criticized others for being too far on the idealism side. I think that there needs to be a mix. So are there some single issue voters who would change their vote because of the gun safety stuff that Democrats do or try to do during the next Congress? It's possible, but when only 50% of the country votes, they are not going to swing the election, and you can more than outdo them simply by focusing on voter turnout. So the pragmatist reality is much of what the Democrats would propose in the House wouldn't make it through a Republican Senate, period. So then the question very quickly becomes, what can you actually achieve? And what would be the political risk of doing that, as the question is? My approach would be try to get some wins. And I don't want to call them small wins because these are important things, but they are not necessarily the biggest things that the left would want to do. 100% background checks and a mandatory waiting period. Okay. It's possible that if you negotiate with senators, if you figure out a way to get Trump on board, even if it's by sheer confusion and not understanding what it is that's being proposed, which is absolutely fine. Does the guy understand anything that's being proposed? You might be able to do 100% background checks and a mandatory waiting period, and it might unfortunately have to be wrapped in to some other bill or package with unrelated stuff. That is how it doesn't have to be that way, but that's how they have chosen to do a lot of this stuff, and it's unfortunate. Could you maybe get an age limit where if you're under 21, you can't buy semi-automatic rifles? I don't know if you can do that. That would, those three things, 100% background checks, no 21-year-old, no 21 and under 21, buying semi-automatic rifles, and a mandatory waiting period, that actually would have reduced or prevented or made extraordinarily more unlikely some of the mass shootings that we have had. And then think about making more progress in 2020 if the election goes well and you take over the House and Senate. That would be my advice, which is a balance between actually trying to make some accomplishments without risking alienation of voters over that issue. Last question today. Hey, David, if you had to pick a cult to join, which one would it be? You've interviewed people who have left cults many times over the years, and I'm curious if you had to join one, which one would it be? There's really no way to talk about this without addressing what's the difference between a religion and a cult. There are some people who say all religions are cults. There are others who sort of come up with this jokey idea of, well, religions are old, they've been around for a long time, whereas the cults are new, and that's how you distinguish them. And of course, there is something to the perception of religion versus cult based on their age, but I don't know that that's actually fair. It's actually sort of difficult right now for me to really define religion versus cult, because cult has an understandably negative sort of pejorative connotation. But when you look at the definitions of cult versus religion, you often find that the differences are matters of degree, that those characteristics which are attributed to cults exist in most religions except to a lesser degree. So I'm going to admit in answering the question that we probably need to better assess exactly when it's a cult and when it's a religion. But my answer is Mormonism. Either way, I think that if I had to join a cult, and I know people will say Mormonism is no cult, David, the way I'm interpreting the question, I would probably join Mormonism for the sole reason that Mormons seem to be pretty damn successful because they have really effective networks for working with each other, helping each other build businesses in a way that most other communities and cults don't. In fact, you often saw the opposite. I recently read about a whole book, fantastic, by Jeff Quinn about the Jim Jones cult and Jonestown. And one of the things they didn't get right, and I'm using that term very loosely, is that with very few exceptions, they didn't actually generate this network where the people that were part of the cult were living well. If I'm going to join a cult, I at least want to feel like I'm going to be in a community where I'm going to do really well personally, even if I'm participating in something that's horrible. Mormonism seems to have that. And that may be a crazy way to decide which cult I would join. I also don't think that as far as cults go, Mormonism does too much in the way of physical violence against people who don't necessarily want to participate or become disaffected or choose to leave, although there's probably examples of everything. So I'm ready for the criticism. I know people will say either, David, you're wrong about Mormonism, they are violent, or they're not that successful in the world, or Mormonism is just not a cult and I shouldn't be including it. But I answer the questions the way I understand them to be asked, and Mormonism is probably the cult that I would join. On the bonus show today, we will talk about our upcoming Thanksgiving breaks. We will also address a question I've gotten a few times. Given that I am so against the institution of a royal family and of the sort of chance of being born into a position of authority in that way, would I respect members of royal families if I were to meet them? We're going to talk about that on the bonus show, and also we'll talk about Master Race Guy. This is a story I didn't cover on the regular show, and there's a really specific reason why, and we're going to address that on the bonus show. 2 ways to get instant access to the bonus show. 1, become a member at www.joinpacman.com. If you want to save 40% off of your membership, you can do that by using the coupon code THISIS2020. This is 2020. You can also make a pledge of at least $5 a month at patreon.com/David Pakman Show and get instant access to the bonus show. I will see you then. If not, have a good Thanksgiving. We'll be back with new shows on Monday.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.